Despite a plethora of amateur theories about Melanesian, South American, Egyptian, Phoenician and Celtic colonization of New Zealand, there is not a shred of evidence that the first human settlers were anything other than Polynesian. Physiological, genetic, linguistic, mythological, artifactual and botanic evidence blends into a symphony of accord on this conclusion. The only points in doubt are precisely where these people launched their expeditions of colonization, when and where they arrived, and how many of them founded the New Zealand Māori population. The search by such late 19th and early 20th century scholars as Edward Tregear and Stevenson Percy Smith for the origins of the Māori, were they Aryan, were they a lost tribe of Israel, is now recognized as irrelevant. Māori people and culture, as encountered by European navigators in the 17th and 18th centuries, evolved in New Zealand. And the forebears of Māori, the Polynesians, developed their culture in the central South Pacific, most probably on the islands of Tonga, Samoa, Uvea and Futuna. Antecedents beyond that point are more speculative, though increasingly the subject of scholarly consensus. That consensus now accepts that several hominoid species evolved simultaneously in Africa, diverging from other primates around 5 million years ago. Fossil remains have revealed that one of those species, Homo erectus, reached Asia and Indonesia, the latter in the form of Java man, some 1.8 million years ago. But these human-like creatures travelled no further geographically, though they may have survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago. Less than 100,000 years ago, another group, Homo sapiens, the ancestors of modern humankind, also emerged from Africa. Genetic analysis shows that part of this migration travelled north and east into Central Asia and then westward into Europe. Another branch took an easterly route along the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, around the perimeter of India and eventually onto the coast of Southeast Asia and the archipelagos of Malaysia, Indonesia, New Guinea, New Britain and the Solomon Islands. The section of this population that remained on the edge of the western Pacific Ocean became the first ancestors of today's Melanesian people. The group who went south were the founding population of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. Their movements were possible because the last ice age had shrunk sea levels and the Indonesian islands were attached to Eurasia in a geographic unit now called Sunda. And New Guinea, Australia and Tasmania were joined in a landmass now referred to as Sahul. The earliest migrants, therefore, both Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, had been able to travel largely on foot, requiring only short island-hopping voyages, probably by raft, to get from Sunda to Sahul. By around 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age was over and sea levels had risen, isolating the archipelagos of the Philippines, Indonesia and New Guinea, detaching Australia from New Guinea, and Tasmania from the Australian mainland. Movements of populations through the region would then be possible only by people with well-developed maritime technology, and such a people emerged from the mainland of Southeast Asia some 5,000 to 6,000 years ago and pushed out eastwards into the Central Pacific, where no human beings had preceded them. They are known from their language group as Austronesians, and the spread of that language shows that, astonishingly, some travelled as far west as Madagascar. Others went eastwards along the Malaysian and Indonesian archipelagos, along the coast of New Guinea and the Bismarck archipelago, first settled by Aboriginal colonists more than 30,000 years earlier, and eventually as far as Easter Island and the coast of South America. These voyages, ranging around more than half the globe at a time when Europeans had not yet ventured beyond the Mediterranean or the coast of their continent, were analogous in daring and accomplishment to the later exploration of space. Indeed, the Pacific Ocean, with its widely spaced islands dotted across a vast surface, was a kind of terrestrial mirror for the galaxy, the Milky Way, which provided Polynesian sailors with stellar markers for celestial navigation. Peter Buck, the great Māori anthropologist, called his forebears Vikings of the sunrise, He would have done them and northern Europeans greater honour had he referred to the Vikings as Polynesians. Beyond cultural imperatives, what made the prodigious voyages of the Polynesians and their Austronesian ancestors possible was the introduction to Southeast Asia of the sail and the invention of the outrigger to stabilize dugout canoes on ocean voyages. While their predecessors had, for the most part, walked, the Austronesian speakers entered the Pacific and the Indian Oceans as mariners with the technology, the curiosity, and the courage to carry them where no human beings had preceded them. By 4,000 years ago, one section of these people was making distinctly incised lapita pottery on the islands of the Bismarck archipelago. The subsequent spread of that pottery to New Caledonia, whence came the name Lapita, Santa Cruz, Vanuatu, Fiji, and ultimately to Tonga and Samoa by some 3,000 years ago, has enabled archaeologists to trace the footprints of these ancestral Polynesians. On Tonga and Samoa, a region that has come to be known as West Polynesia, the migrants appear to have paused for the best part of a millennium, developing, refining and consolidating that set of cultural characteristics we now recognize as Polynesian. They included the form of Austronesian language ancestral to New Zealand Māori, a pantheon of named gods, systems of kinship and rank, pervasive concepts such as mana and tapu, and distinctive shapes for their stone adzes. These people had also brought with them animals and plants, some of them transported from as far away as the Southeast Asian mainland, pigs, dogs, rats, fowls, and cultivated plants such as taro, yam, gourds, bananas, breadfruit, pandanus, sugarcane, and paper mulberry. They may also have carried with them the coconut palm. Many of these things, the impedimenta of intellectual and material culture, would be carried forward in another migration, this time into the islands of East Polynesia, almost 1,000 years after the colonization of Central Polynesia. There the culture would be modified further, linguistically, conceptually, and artifactually, into forms more directly related to those inherited by New Zealand Māori. And it would be the identical shape in New Zealand and East Polynesia of contemporary artifacts and ornaments in stone and bone, adzes, chisels, fishhooks, harpoon points, pendants, together with a shared mythology that would make explicit the immediate ancestry of the Māori. East Polynesians had one more taonga or cultural treasure which they would bring with them to New Zealand, and which would ultimately prove crucial to the survival of their people and the further development of their culture there, the kumara, or sweet potato. In contrast to everything else that these migrant people had lugged from island to island, the kumara had not come from the west. It was a vegetable from Central or South America, originating probably in Peru. This uncomfortable fact is susceptible to one of only two possible explanations. Either voyagers from South America carried the vegetable into Polynesia, which was the theory of the Norwegian adventurer Thor Heyerdahl, or Polynesians themselves sailed as far east as continental America and returned with the kumara to island Polynesia. The latter theory is more likely. It is given additional weight by the fact that the coconut seems to have been taken from Southeast Asia to Central America, where it was flourishing in the time of Columbus, and the most likely explanation is that it was carried across the Pacific to the Americas by Polynesians. Apart from the kumara, there is no other unequivocal evidence of South American influence in Polynesia, and no trace of South American genes among Polynesians. But there is evidence that, by the first millennium of the Christian era, Polynesians were making extraordinarily widespread return voyages throughout the Central and South Pacific. For many years, Western scholars argued about whether the Polynesian colonization of the Pacific, a stupendous achievement when one confronts their starting point and the area of ocean enclosed by the triangular boundaries of Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, was a consequence of deliberate or accidental voyaging. A careful study of available navigation techniques and computer simulations of voyages, allowing for prevailing winds, currents and weather systems, have led to the inescapable conclusion that Polynesian voyaging was wide-ranging and was deliberate. As they moved eastwards, navigators tacked and searched largely in upwind quadrants, away from their points of departure, in directions from which they could most easily and most safely return downwind. This ensured three outcomes: that they had a means of getting home, whether or not they discovered new islands, that initial voyages were conventionally two-way, and that such voyages of discovery would precede voyages of deliberate colonization, which would then make for a known and reported destination with appropriate navigational directions. This was the sequence and pattern of voyages that would have preceded the more difficult Polynesian discovery and colonization of New Zealand. As they sailed, navigators would search for signs of land beyond the visible horizon, the presence of birds feeding offshore or migrating, and, in the years preceding the introduction of the Kiori, the numbers of sea-feeding birds would have been immensely larger than in modern times. Cloud formations which attached themselves to as yet unseen atolls, changes in the patterns of ocean currents and swells. These signs, in combination, created what have been called island screens, which greatly enlarged the navigator's potential target areas. Stars at night and the direction of the sun and ocean swells by day enabled navigators to maintain a running fix on their position and to repeat voyages or to pass on sailing directions to subsequent travellers. This combination of techniques permitted the discovery and settlement of the islands of West and East Polynesia and took its practitioners as far east as Easter Island and South America. With such possibilities exhausted, subsequent exploration would have been attempted across the wind, which permitted the discovery of the Hawaiian Islands to the north, and across and downwind, the difficult but by no means impossible 3,000-kilometre journey southwest to New Zealand. Why were such voyages made at all? What drove Polynesian travellers eastwards, then north and southwards, other than the techniques which made such movement possible? We can only speculate. Some pressures would have been environmental: overcrowding, shortages of gardening space, depletion of lagoon resources. Other oral traditions speak of disagreements and warfare among kin, of sons who failed to inherit land or status, even of cannibalism, propelling island settlers into the role of their forebears, that of island migrants. But such circumstances were occasions for leaving home rather than causes. James Belich identified what he called an ethos of expansion, which assured Polynesians that new lands had always been found in the past and therefore would be in the future. Failed migrations told no tales. One can take this concept further. There was clearly something spiritually significant about the movement eastwards. Early burials in Polynesian islands had corpses trussed into a sitting position and facing east, and a proverb carried from island Polynesia to New Zealand may also express part of the reality of that ethos. E korique I ngaro, e ruia mai I Rangiatea. I shall not perish, but as a seed sent forth from Rangiatea I shall flourish. There may have been a phase in Polynesian culture in which the urge to discover new lands was strong, even irresistible, as was perhaps the belief in personal and corporate invincibility, strengthened by proven navigation techniques and the development of large, fast and safe outrigger or double canoes under sail. In addition, there was confidence in the interventionary attention of protective deities. Polynesian tradition is replete with stories of individuals and crews saved from disaster by one or other of the gods, and in the power of priests to mediate between such deities and humankind. When the navigator Ru was travelling from Rangiatea to Aitutaki, for example, his canoe sailed into a whirlpool which began to suck the vessel and its crew into the depths of the ocean. They were saved by a sacred invocation to Tangaroa. Tangaroa I te titi, Tangaroa I te tata. Whakawatiangia te kare o te moana, whakawatiangia ngā kapua o te rangi, kia tae o ki te whenua, I tō mana kohea e au. As Bellich observed, magic, prayer and technical skill packaged each other. Evidence from the New Zealand region alone indicates just how confidently and how extensively widespread voyages may have been made. Ivory fishhooks and chert on Enderby Island and the subantarctic Auckland Islands reveal that the Polynesians were there, at the very least visiting, around 1350 AD. Similar carbon dates and fragments of Mare Island obsidian link sites in the Kermadec and Norfolk Island to New Zealand at about the same time. And adzes from the original colonisation of Pitcairn Island show an extraordinarily close affinity to those found in contemporary New Zealand sites. At some point in the past millennium, however, possibly around the 14th or 15th century AD, the era of widespread Polynesian voyaging ceased. This may have occurred because of the change in climate that produced colder, windier weather and rougher seas, or possibly because of a change in cultural priorities. And this literal and metaphorical alteration in direction left colonists on the margins of their cultural and geographical triangle, especially in New Zealand and Easter Island, isolated from other Polynesians. It may also have led to the abandonment of earlier settlements on Pitcairn, Henderson, Norfolk and the Line Islands, which were viable only in an era of regular contact with other food and population sources. By this time, however, the great voyages of exploration had been accomplished, and the Polynesians had become the most widely dispersed people on the planet.